Hi everyone, and welcome to the 7th episode of Sales Leader Stories. I'm your host Omar from Stacked, and today we've got an amazing episode coming up with Ryan, who is Head of Enterprise Sales at Airwallex. On today's show, we're going to be talking about his journey into sales, becoming Stripe's top-performing sales rep, transitioning from IC to Head of Sales, and a whole lot more. So without further ado, let's jump straight in. Ryan, welcome to the podcast. Thank you for joining.
Thanks for having me. Excited to be here.
So Ryan, if you don't mind, I would love to go right back to the start and ask you what your journey into sales looked like.
Yeah, great question. So I originally kind of stumbled into sales. So my career really started in athletics. So post graduating from UC Davis, where I played football, I really wanted to get into sports marketing. That was kind of my dream, wanted to work for the 49ers. And so I actually worked two jobs post university where I was working for a nonprofit, and then I was actually working for a European football team, so Sacramento Republic FC. And I was doing kind of more marketing partnerships type role there, and quickly learned that it's a labor of love. You're working long hours, you're working weekends, you're kind of having to jump all over the States to go to games and events. And I'd grown up in Silicon Valley and done some internships on University Avenue in Palo Alto with tech companies, and really had an opportunity to join an early stage startup. And so when I joined the startup, it was 6 people at the time, bootstrapped. I joined actually as an account manager. But the funny thing was the company didn't have enough accounts to manage. So the founder said, hey, you're going to split your time between sales and account management until we fill up enough accounts for you to manage. And that's really where I fell in love with sales. That's where I kind of realized there's a lot of alignment between my background in athletics and kind of the competition side of sports and metrics driven approach with sales. And so that was really where I look back and I'm like, that's where I learned how to do sales. That's where I really fell in love with it. And then eventually found my way over to Stripe, where was there for about 5.5 years, all within sales. And then currently at Airwallex, where I head up our enterprise sales team.
Amazing. And like you said, it was cool that you started like a little 5-6 man startup. You said that basically straight away that you kind of fell in love with sales. What is it? Kind of like traditional sales as we think of now? You were account exec, you were kind of closing business. Was it a bit more, like you said, early stage startup, kind of figuring things out as you went along?
Yeah, so the founder, I'll talk about the founder because I think that aligns a lot to why I enjoyed it. So the founder was a very unique guy, this guy named Justin Siri, who was a former naval officer on a nuclear submarine turned GSB turned McKinsey turned startup founder, and had a really interesting approach to building the business. And the rest of the business was a bunch of kind of new grads who had athletic backgrounds or played sports and kind of all came together. And as I mentioned, we were bootstrapped. And so I remember my first week in the business, we kind of sat around the table and Justin was like, we have 3 months of runway. How are we going to close the gap? And I was eyes wide open. I was like, oh my gosh, this is like real. I might not be here if we don't start closing deals. And the really exciting thing was every single deal that you brought in and closed had an impact on the business and had an impact on the people sitting around you. So if you closed a deal that was $2,500 a month, all of a sudden you extended the runway 2 months and everyone around you had a job for another 2 months. But at the same time, so there was that real excitement of like the camaraderie, bringing this together. We're actually building something. And then the alignment with working with product. That was really my first interaction of working with product, where we were able to have an impact on building the business based on what our customers were asking for, both in the sales process and the existing business process. So I think having that type of founder, that type of experience where you're truly having an impact on the business was really rewarding for me. And so that's part of the reason why I fell in love with it.
Interesting. And yeah, definitely incentivized you to make the sales, right? With only 3 months runway left.
Yeah, it incentivized me. But then we also had this manager, this guy named Jake Surf, who he was really, I think, the one who taught us kind of new hires in this business, like the art of sales is what I call it. So he was the one who kind of really took this student approach to sales, where every week we would actually have a sales session where we'd sit around in the office. One of us would read a sales book, right? And come in and start teaching the rest about this sales book. And so the really interesting thing was we were all kind of cherry picking great ideas from each other and then implementing that into our sales process and creating this really kind of, as I mentioned, like team-based approach to sales where not only are we trying to grow the business, build this up, raise our Series A, we're also trying to get better every day so we can have an impact on these deals and get more out of every single deal that we're closing.
Interesting. No, it sounds like you kind of, built all the kind of foundational sales skill set. You felt that you fell in love with sales. From that point on, so I think it was maybe a year that you spent there. Then you moved to Stripe as an account exec. Can you tell me how this opportunity came up and what it was like joining Stripe 8 years ago?
Yeah, my journey to joining Stripe's an interesting one because I actually, before I joined the startup, I cold emailed Stripe. They had this role on their website because I knew I wanted to get into sales post working athletics. And they had this, I forget what it was called, but it was one of those where it's like, if you don't see your role above, just send us an email and we'll see if we can find a spot for you. And so I applied with that. And the recruiter reached out to me at the time and said, hey, we actually don't have a sales team. So one of the interesting things about Stripe is they actually grew to about 200 employees without a sales team because they were really focused on this self-sign-up model, being able to allow developers and engineers to integrate without ever having to talk to somebody. And so when I spoke to the recruiter at the time, she said, hey, we have this role in BizOps. Do you want to apply for that? That's kind of seems like it might be in your background. And I remember I went through the process. I spoke to two people, and then I actually pulled out and went to the startup because I had decided I really did want to do sales and account management and kind of be more in that role rather than something that was more operational. And so when I was at Storybox, the startup I was talking about, went through that process, and then we kind of plateaued when we went to raise our Series A. And that's when I reached back out to that recruiter, and she said, this is actually great timing because we're building out our initial sales team. So I joined back when Stripe was around 200 employees, and they were really starting to build out the first sales team. So I think we only had a handful of sales reps in that first class that came in, and a handful of account managers that were already there. So it was really kind of the luck of building that relationship with the recruiter the first time. So then when I reached out the second time, that opportunity was there and I could capitalize it and joined pretty early on, which was a really exciting point.
Interesting. No, it's an amazing story. And could you speak to the what the kind of like environment was like joining Stripe at that time? I mean, obviously, especially from the European perspective looking in, they were kind of like, I don't know, poster child of this kind of Silicon Valley Bay Area, Y Combinator backed hypergrowth startup. What was it like at the point you joined?
Yeah, so one of the things that Stripe did really interesting in those early days was they actually were not looking for individuals with sales backgrounds to hire as sales team. They actually wanted people who could wear multiple hats and do a lot of different things. And so I remember we had, one AE who was formerly an engineer. We had a couple people who had just graduated from business school, a couple people who were, in the music industry, and then transferred over. And so you had this really interesting collection of backgrounds with people who were really more builders than they were sales reps at the beginning. And that's exactly what Stripe needed. Because I remember when we first joined, sales was a very new concept. And so when we came in, it was very much a question around, okay, we have this self-sign-up flow. It's working really well. Like, what is sales going to do? How is it going to fit in? And sales organization at Stripe really wanted to be self-sufficient. So the leadership at the time said, listen, we're not going to have a bunch of solution engineers. We're not going to, have developers on the call. You guys just need to figure it out. And so I remember there was a handful of us in the early days where Stripe offered this coding bootcamp. And you had a ton of AEs joining that coding bootcamp to learn how to code, not necessarily because we wanted to be developers, but we wanted to uplevel our technical sales capabilities so we could actually go through the API documentation with these CTOs, help them integrate, answer questions about API requests on the call in real time. And so you built out this really interesting self-sufficient sales org who were very technical sellers, by going and learning internally about how our product works, how we can scale this, how to sell to CTOs and developers.
Interesting. First time I heard that, I absolutely love that sales people having to learn how to code so that they know the technical skill set. That's interesting because it doesn't happen so much right now. Like you have like you said, sales engineers, and these are the people who kind of come in and kind of outsource that responsibility. But again, they were just trying to build you into these kind of self-sustaining, independent sales reps that didn't need to kind of take any resources from the rest of the team. Interesting. Okay, cool. And so from that point onwards, I had to check these numbers on Crunchbase before. I mean, the growth rate is staggering. As I understand, you joined in 2016. That year, Stripe's payment volume is $20 billion. The year you leave, 2021, their payment volume is $640 billion. This is a 32x return. Can you just summarize the changes you witnessed, what you learned, basically having a front row seat on, arguably one of the greatest startup growth stories in recent times?
Yeah, one of the things Stripe did incredibly well is building for scale. And the reason, my personal belief is the reason why they're able to have this growth is everything that they built, every process that they built out, every operational adjustment they made, every product they focus on is built for scale. And so if they're going to go and do something for a customer, it's not a question of, hey, we want this logo, let's go build out this product so this logo works and we can find this logo and bring them in. It was, okay, if we build this for this customer, is it going to benefit the rest of our customers? And that was always the product approach that they took. And so with sales, you really had to have that product first mentality where you're helping your customers understand, like, listen, if you guys want to utilize this product in the way it's designed, you're going to be able to scale your business into these new countries globally very quickly, rather than maybe a competitor saying, we'll go do XYZ for you and we'll build this out and we'll do a custom approach. So I think that was one of the big kind of approaches that Stripe took early on. That's the reason they have a ton of success. I think from a sales perspective, what Stripe did really well is we kind of called it payments nerdery, right? Is not just the technical side of things, but really becoming a student of the game with regards to understanding interchange rates and schemes and local payment methods. And back then, this was when you had Adyen, Stripe, Checkout, the new wave of these payment companies coming along. And so payments was very much at the forefront of fintech. And so being able to go into a conversation with the head of payments and teach them something every time about the industry was a really unique trait that we were trying to instill with all of our reps. So the combination of that build for scale, payments nerdery approach really was one of the reasons why Stripe had a lot of success early on.
Interesting. Okay, cool. And then so on the backdrop of this hyper growth, I imagine crazy expansion in headcount, you went, I think, from account exec to marketplace sales lead to strategic accounts lead. Can you just tell me about your own individual journey at Stripe? What was kind of changing in terms of role, responsibilities, all of these kind of things?
Yeah, so early days, I've always was in a sales role at Stripe, and in the early days, really focused on startups. So Stripe was a startup focus, and then kind of worked their way up. With regards to the first role, it was a high quantity type role. So I remember this was back before the Zoom days where you had like the join.me and Uber conference links. And I remember we would have to sign up with both because we would have one login and we'd have to have a second login and then to revert back to the other login. So customers weren't jumping on the same login, which was a very common issue in those early days. And we would kind of stack our early morning meetings with back to back to back, and then you'd move through that process. One of the things that we did at Stripe in those early days was that I really liked is we'd kind of cherry pick from each other what was working best in the sales role. And that allowed us to take, Ross on my team was doing this very well, Nosley was doing this very well, I was doing this very well. And we kind of align that together to create the best possible sales process from all of the AEs. And so I think, I don't think I was special in any sense. I just think I was very good at seeing what other people were doing and cherry picking their ideas and then implementing those ideas. And then that kind of moved me into my next role where I had more of a platform and marketplace focus. So we have this product named Connect, which is the marketplace product used by Shopify and a bunch of other marketplaces that are on Stripe today. And with that, I differentiated myself from, I think, some of the rest of the team by just really going deep on that product. Like one of the things Patrick and John always talk about is if you're going to do anything from a business perspective, just go very deep on one product and learn that, or one industry, learn that very well, and then expand from there. So I kind of took that advice and went after marketplace and platforms and had a lot of success in that role for quite a bit. And I had hit about 4.5 years at this time. And I was really interested in what that next challenge would be. And I had a really good relationship with the international teams. We would always fly them in and train them and onboard them in San Francisco. So I had an opportunity to build out really good relationships. And when the country manager of the UK reached out to me and said, "Hey, we have an opportunity to bring you out here. You can help us, build out the team and expand the enterprise function," because it was very, very new at the point. There were only 2 people really in the enterprise function in the UK at the time. And so I flew out a week before COVID, the first lockdown. So it was a little bit of a culture shock and at the same time being put into lockdown. But I spent that last year in the UK really working on our largest and most strategic enterprise accounts. And then by that point, when I left, Stripe was about 6,000. And I had this opportunity to join Airwallex as kind of first boots on the ground to help build out the enterprise function in EMEA. And the reason why I left was simply due to the fact like I really enjoyed that early stage cross-functional work, working with product, building out the product from the ground up. And so saw that opportunity with Airwallex to get back to those early stages of a company that I truly enjoyed.
Amazing. And so cool. So on the point, I didn't realize the last year at Stripe that you spent in the UK. Did you feel like it was, okay, I imagine like this crazy startup energy, San Francisco Bay Area, all of those kind of things. Did you feel like you were kind of, I don't know, stepping out of the fire as it was coming to the UK? Could we have less of a startup scheme, or it was still super high energy, we're still going after it, it's a bigger opportunity even opening a new market?
Yeah, one of the things that made me really excited about the opportunity in the UK and the EU at the time was the fact that the payments landscape in Europe is so much more complex and far ahead than the US, right? At the time in the US, you had credit cards and Apple Pay and Google Pay were just kind of becoming a thing. And now you move to UK and EU and you have all of these local payment methods, Ideal, P24, SEPA, so forth. You have, faster payment rails, SEPA rails, and just understanding the payments landscape in Europe and the EEA was one of the big reasons that made me really excited about it. Because when I was selling to customers in North America, when you move into enterprise, those customers are inherently global. They're inherently going to be in APAC, North America, LATAM, EMEA. And so I really wanted to up-level my product knowledge and industry knowledge of how payments works outside of the US. So I would say from a fintech standpoint, that was a driver. And then the other part that I found really interesting was just the amount of fintechs coming out of the UK at the time, right? So the regulatory sandbox that allows fintechs to get started here, it's really unique. And so it was a much different sale. Instead of selling to, on-demand marketplaces or software platforms, you're selling to people who understand payments. And so you really have to bring your A game in those conversations because they have this knowledge that maybe you were using as a competitive advantage in the past to educate people. Now these individuals know this and they might know it better than you. And so you really have to make sure you're showing up with your A game.
Interesting. But then I assume the kind of whole ethos and culture at Stripe, having put you through a coding bootcamp, having made you understand the product inside out, kind of gave you a good foundation to succeed in the UK market.
Absolutely. Yeah. It was having that product knowledge because the core product doesn't change. It's just the ancillary bits, right? Like the localized payment methods or the currencies or dealing with the exchange or the fact that interchange costs are regulated. So it was really kind of understanding the local process. But also, I think one of the things that can't be overlooked is the buying process is just different. The buying process in Europe, in every single country is different, and they care about different things. And so especially if you're a small team who's covering all of the EEA from a sales process, you need to be able to kind of adjust and be a chameleon in your sales process, depending on who your buyer is and where they're located. And that was something that, holds true in the US to an extent, but is just much more common. And I'm aware of it having sold in Europe.
Interesting. Okay, so over the 5 years that you were at Stripe, there are some incredibly impressive accolades on your LinkedIn. I think it was first couple of years, number one global rep in terms of new user activations. Last couple of years, number one global rep in terms of total revenue. Can you summarize basically what it takes to be the number one global rep at a hyper growth company like Stripe when you think of, I don't know, the attitude, the mindset, the skill set that you needed to have?
Yeah, I think I have a much different view moving into leadership from being an IC on this point now. When one of the things I think, if I could give any advice to like up and coming sales reps is, and this is first day actually on the job, I walk into Stripe, we had a cafeteria, I sit down with one of the first AEs that had joined Stripe. He started in biz ops, moved over to an AE, and I sat down with him and I was like, what should I do? How do I succeed here? How do I be successful? And he was like, numbers cure all. And I've always held that very close in sales, no matter what's going on, no matter what happens, numbers cure all. If you're hitting your goal and you're overachieving, like you're going to be just fine. And so I kind of took that mentality of when I first came in, okay, what does John and Patrick, what does my manager, what does our head of sales care about? And in the early days, the sales metrics were still being built out. So we actually didn't have a lot of insight into Ryan closed 10 deals. This is what it equates to in terms of revenue. And so we were focused on activating new users. And then activation was getting that customer live, them processing X amount, and then scaling from there. So I said, this is what I'm going to focus on. I'm going to close as many customers as I can as quickly as possible, get them to scale and support them in that growth. And then once we built out actual insights in the sales ops organization, and actually had insight into the revenue that reps were growing, then that was the North Star. And so I transitioned over to, okay, this is what I care about. This is what I'm going to focus on. I'm going to get as many high quality customers over the line and focused on the value, not the quantity anymore. And so being able to align on what the organization cares about and what that North Star is like part one. But then part two is understanding the customer and understanding that opportunity. So Stripe had a lot of inbound opportunities, but they weren't always high quality, right? Like I remember in the early days, you'd hop on a call and you talk to them for 15, 20 minutes. And then at the end of the call, they'd say, this is awesome. I want to move forward. How do I get one of those little readers? And I was like, oh no, we're Stripe. You want Square. And that was actually a really common problem in the early days.
Yeah.
And so you needed to be able to sort through and say, okay, that customer I can disqualify, and then this customer I can focus on. And so that was something I focused on really early, is like, how do you just focus on those high quality customers, disqualify early? You hear about this all the time in sales. Like, how do you disqualify early? And then the last one is just being a resource for those customers. So we talked about this a little bit earlier in the call, but like actually truly understanding the product. So I didn't have to rely on a solution engineers. I didn't have to rely on a PM to come in and help me sell the deal. I could be very self-sufficient. And then the last piece is I just kind of looked at my resources as a tool belt. So I had this amazing manager at Stripe who I always referred to him as like my secret weapon in my tool belt, where when it came to pricing negotiations, like he had full faith in me understanding the product, understanding the revenue, and being able to price them. But I would always bring him in on the last call to help negotiate and be like, this is something that I'm fully invested as a leader. This is something that, we want to move forward with, showing that he was supporting me in those decisions. And little things like that make a big difference when you're working with the customer. If they understand that it's not just a single rep at Stripe working with you, but it's actually this rep's manager, there's more people behind the scenes who are supporting this relationship, it makes a really big impact. So that's just kind of a small example of the way I would look at the tool belt and bring in certain supporting resources when needed late in the deal cycle.
Interesting. You mentioned some great points there. One question, do you feel like there's anything else in terms of the consistency that you hit it as well? So it is being customer centric, it is being numbers driven, it is being aligned with the organizational needs. But to have done it consistently over 5 years, do you think there's anything else that kind of went into it, or it was basically having those foundations in place?
Yeah, it's constantly being a student of the game, in my opinion. So I never thought I was the best person, honestly. I always felt like there were better reps at Stripe, and I was just very good at watching them, understanding what they did, and duplicating that in a way that worked for me. So, for example, there's a guy named Ross Rich who's the founder of Accord. He was tail and tail with me every single year. Like he could have easily been the number one rep every single year. We were head and head most of those years, and he was amazing at putting account plans together, putting close plans together, building out ROI charts, which is something that I just wasn't focused on, but I could replicate what he was doing because again, we had that team-based approach at Stripe as well, where he was sharing what he was doing. He was sharing, his ROI models, his account plans. And I was like, wow, this is great. I can replicate this. And then we had, a AE named Nosley who was incredible at building relationships with customers. And that was something where I was trying to replicate her process of being able to really get inside the room, spend time with those customers, get on site. And then the last thing was I was just never afraid to travel. And I think that's post-COVID overlooked right now. I didn't care. I remember I closed one marketplace based in Akron, Ohio, and I was up against Adyen. And one of the last factors they said was, you were willing to hop on a plane next day while we kind of had to beg that team to come out here. And I was always willing to hop on a plane and travel because I knew if I could get on site, my close rate would actually increase. And again, post COVID, I think it's overlooked a bit that if you're not spending time with the customer, your competitor is. And it makes a huge difference if you can look that customer in the eye and you can have a conversation and they can trust you versus not being able to try to close that entire deal process over Zoom. I think those days are starting to dwindle and you need to get on site with these customers again.
Amazing. And then obviously, like, you joined at a pretty incredible time at Stripe. It was this hyper growth. You were growing. You were being global number one rep. Interested to know your thoughts on tenure. I think this is like an interesting thing in sales, especially now with how prevalent LinkedIn is. I imagine someone like yourself, who is the top performing rep, has a lot of recruiters trying to tell them about new roles, all of these kind of things. Interested to know, obviously 5.5 years is quite a long time, especially for someone who's joining as a junior account exec. Was it just the circumstance and the timing of everything? Do you feel like there is some kind of added value and you kind of recommend people try and find a role that they can stick out for a longer period of time?
That's a tough question because I think it's really based on the individual. And I think when you stop enjoying the role, like that's when you might start looking for new opportunities. And it wasn't that I wasn't enjoying my time at Stripe when I left. I wasn't actively looking actually when I did leave Stripe, but the opportunity when it came up with Airwallex to come back and be kind of earlier in the company's life cycle, like that really excited me and sparked joy. So I think for me, as I progressed at Stripe, as I stayed there, I was always enjoying it. I was always feeling challenged. I was always excited about coming into work. And once we got to that 6,000 mark, I was still enjoying it. And I really look back at my time at Stripe with like a very positive outlook. But once I got to the point, I said, I think having an impact, being earlier in the process, really kind of building something from the ground up is a unique opportunity that I should take a chance on. So I think when you find a company that invests in you, that you enjoy, that's doing something different, that's pushing the boundaries, like lock onto that, stay on that, because every company has highs and lows. Every day is going to be different than the next. But if you can have a long-term outlook on the business and the role and the opportunity, I think that's the best way to approach it.
Amazing. So from that point onwards, you did transition to Airwallex. I think you've been there for 3 years now. Can you, summarize what it was like when you joined and what the journey's been like so far?
Yeah, so I joined, as you mentioned, 3 years ago as of, I think, pretty recently. And Airwallex started as more of a SMB, SME solution. And about little more than 3 years ago, probably about closer to 4 years, is when we launched our enterprise and our platform product. So Airwallex provides financial infrastructure for businesses to move money globally. And one of the reasons why I got so excited about the opportunity at Airwallex was I knew when I left Stripe, I didn't want to, directly compete with them. And when I joined Airwallex, there was a lot of things Airwallex was focusing on that was in parallel with Stripe and complementary to what Stripe was doing. So the treasury, the banking, the expense management, kind of all the ancillary pieces that can work really well alongside a business. And so the reason why I joined was, again, I talked about this, but it's very rare to join a hyper-growth company and be able to be first boots on the ground for a new product within an organization. So it kind of brought together the two previous roles. So I was, we had myself, an individual in partnerships and an individual in strategy, and that was the team when I first joined. Now we have, 20 plus in EMEA on just the enterprise business, and even more across our offices in Amsterdam, London, and in Lithuania and Tel Aviv. And so when I joined, I really saw this opportunity to bring the experience from Storybox of being a small startup and the experience of Stripe of being a hyper-growth company and be able to implement both of those into a single role. So for me, it was the opportunity to truly have that impact and make a decision here that would help us scale globally. And it's been working out really well. We've been growing quite quickly over the last few years. I think when I joined, we were around 700, and now we're over 1,500 employees globally.
Oh, wow.
So it's been a really exciting ride.
No, good to hear it. And in terms of the actual job itself, being head of sales, was that something always that you were aiming towards? Did you ever kind of consider, I don't know, just keep being the number one global rep as an account exec, or it was something you knew early on? That's what you wanted to go towards.
Yeah, no, it was again one of those things where I wasn't actively looking to leave Stripe towards the end of my career there, but I had the GM at the time reached out, Jack, the founder, reached out, had some conversations, and I really aligned with the kind of trajectory of the business and what they were looking to do and what the 5-year plan was. And so for me, when I had that conversation, again, it really sparked those early days interest of like, I do enjoy the startup life. I do enjoy kind of the chaos of coming into work one day and things being completely different. And so it is a tough decision whenever you're looking to leave a business. But for me, it was one of those things where if I'm going to take a chance on myself and I'm going to take a chance on kind of the next opportunity here in fintech, like this is the one that I think is the best chance of being able to have a big impact and truly see a company scale again to potentially the size that Stripe is.
Amazing. And with the role specifically, so I think a lot of SDRs, account execs, they have this plan that they do want to be a head of sales. I imagine, and from speaking to people like yourself, it comes with a whole host of other responsibilities and things that you don't have to think about as an IC. Mm-hmm. Could you just basically break down what the transition was basically to leading a sales team, and basically, what's a day in the life of a head of sales at Airwallex?
Yeah, so I oversee our sales and account management team on the enterprise side of the business. And I think the important thing for individuals to think about before they make a move, not just into a head of sales roles, but just a manager's role, is like, it's completely different. It's a completely different role that really has, your experience in sales or account management will benefit you in this role, but there's, the day-to-day is completely different. And I view it as you go from being a player on the field to being a coach on the sidelines. And so you need to make sure that before you take that jump, that's truly what you want to do. Because I think somebody told me when I was first thinking about this role is like, your calendar is no longer yours. It's your team's. And that's very, very true, where, I'm coming in the same way my manager was to me at Stripe, as like beating the tool belt and bringing me into certain deals at certain stages. That's the approach I take with my team here. And you truly need to be able to also kind of position the team in a way that's not just making the company successful, but also making those individuals successful. And so I think to summarize that, like my biggest advice is just to make sure you're ready for what the role entails, because it is completely different. And the day-to-day is just going to change completely. And one of the things I think I miss most about moving from an IC into a head of sales is just spending the time with those customers, building those relationships, and seeing something from first conversation to launching in product in market. So I think one of the things that really I enjoyed at Stripe and Airwallex is their infrastructure API products. And you can really see something go from a first conversation that's discovery to seeing something launched in the market. And you're like, wow, I actually had a small piece of that. And that was always really rewarding to me. So we still get that, because I have my team and I'm working with my team on that, but you don't have that individual relationship of a sales rep with a buyer from day one.
Okay, zooming out a bit on your overall career trajectory. I know earlier in the conversation you did mention the role that your manager played. Could you just kind of summarize the role that mentorship played in your career development, both as the junior rep being mentored and maybe now as the sales leader being the mentor?
Yeah, so it's a great question because I think mentorship is incredibly important, but can be kind of overlooked in terms of what it actually means. And I looked as mentorship as like, yeah, you might have an official mentor where my sales manager from Stripe, who I'm still in contact with, like he is my mentor. I'll reach out to him with advice for advice all the time and so on and so forth. But your colleagues can also be your mentor. Other AEs can be your mentor, right? Like the way that I talked about earlier in the conversation of being able to cherry pick ideas from the other successful AEs, implement that into my old sales process, and then tweak it to my variation. Like I view that as mentorship because I'm learning from these other AEs. And so I think there's kind of the official mentorship versus the kind of non-official mentorship, if you would, and both are extremely important. And I think the earlier that you can just realize and kind of point out like, oh, this actually is a little bit of a mentorship and really dive deep into that. Because looking back on my career, there were definitely times where I had quote unquote mentors, but I didn't think about it in that way. And I really didn't capitalize on being able to utilize them as a resource as often as I should have. So from an IC and just early in the career, I think have an open mind of what a mentor can be and capitalize that. And then to the second part of the question, now being a mentor, I've had a really fun opportunity with not just Stripe and Airwallex and Storybox, but now with First Round Capital, where I actually mentor individuals in the sales industry. And the thing I've learned about being a mentor is I learn just as much from them and get just as much out of it as they do from me. Because they're asking me a lot of questions where I'm like, oh, that's a great question. And then I give them advice. I'm like, I really should be doing that as well. And I haven't been doing that. And I actually am meeting up with one of my mentors today, and we had a conversation last week. I was talking to her and I was like, this has been probably the most beneficial mentor-mentee relationship because you are asking me the questions that I just never even thought about. And actually, I'm getting much more out of it. So for people who are looking for a mentor, also put yourself in a position to be, or people who want to be mentored, put yourself in a position to also be a mentor, because I think you're going to get a lot out of it as well.
Yeah, no, it was our biggest learning as well. Like the feedback calls that we have with our mentors are equally they equally get as much out of it as the mentees who you think, okay, the inexperienced person is going to get the most out of it from the experience. But actually, I think it's a pretty even balance, which makes it such a good relationship. Okay, cool. Ryan, final question before I let you go. You did mention a couple of great ideas earlier in the call, but what advice would you give to either a younger Ryan just starting out at Stripe or any sales reps just now starting out now, maybe in their first AE role or SDR role on, how they can build a career they can be proud of?
Get outside your comfort zone. I think it sounds easy, but and it's kind of like a high level overview, but I think push yourself to get outside your comfort zone early on in your career. And so kind of to give some real examples is when we were at Storybox, one of the things that we were doing was it was pure outbound. And, we were cold calling people in those early days. For anyone who's ever been an SDR or had a cold call in sales, like it's not fun. It's a really tough job and there's a lot of rejection. And one of the things that we would push ourselves to do is just like when you went around San Francisco, force yourself to have a conversation with random people. And it's really awkward. It's really uncomfortable. But then you get past that stage and you're like, oh, this is nothing. I can handle rejection. I can start talking to random people, and little things like that at like a coffee shop or at a bar or at a restaurant, just like talk to somebody random. And it really helps you grow into a place where you don't find that as uncomfortable. So that's kind of one part. And then the other part is just to be aware of where you can improve. So in the Stripe days, doing that coding class was because I was getting called out by CTOs and engineers of I didn't know what I was talking about. They were asking me questions and I felt very uncomfortable because I couldn't answer them. So just be self-aware of where you need to improve and focus on finding a way to do that. And I think I was lucky at Stripe because they did offer these coding classes, but there's things like General Assembly where I went and took classes there as well to up-level my skills. So there's external resources and places where you can go and find ways to improve your skills. You just need to be aware of that. And then the last one is, as we talked about, the mentor piece. Like, find that mentor early on. Don't be too specific on what a mentor needs to be, and just try to find a way to have somebody there that you can go to for support.
Amazing advice, Ryan. We will end on that note. If anyone has any follow-up questions after this, is LinkedIn a good way to reach you?
Yeah, absolutely. Always on LinkedIn, always available, as all good salespeople should be.
Amazing. Really appreciate your time, Ryan. And yeah, we'll speak again soon.
All right. Thanks so much. Enjoyed having the chat.
Thank you, Ryan.